Alright, my final video. This is part 17, I believe, or it's either 16 or 17. But it's Right to Marry. Now, this one has its own little problems and faults. See, the right to marry does grant someone the right to marry, but I believe it's only in the eyes of the courts. Now, this is where this one gets a little tricky, because marriage is tied to the churches, and the churches have the right to not acknowledge any kind of marriage. But see, you have a right to marriage due to, it doesn't matter what your race, religion, none of that stuff even matters. None of that stuff even matters. You have a right to being married, but see, here's where it gets kind of a little twisty. When you're talking about churches have their rights too. Churches have their rights too, so they have the right to not acknowledge your marriage. But at the same time, you still have a right to be married in the eyes of the state and the eyes of the country. So basically, it's not really marriage. I mean, it's marriage on paper, but it's really more of a civil union. But you don't have a right to go tell a church that they have to acknowledge your marriage. They don't. The church does not have to acknowledge your marriage. That's one of their rights. So, where this really boils down to is back to the separation of church and state. This is why I kind of stand with the separation of church and state a little bit. Because the church does have a right to not have to acknowledge your marriage. But you do have a right to be married if you wish. So that's where the separation of church and state, but it really becomes more of a civil union at that point instead of marriage, because marriage is tied to churches. But in a sense, it's still marriage. So, and you have a right to a family, which means, yes, a gay couple does have a right to adopt a child. The trans person does have a right to adopt a child. And I don't care how much people might disagree with it. That's just the way it is. It's facts. I mean, everybody is created with equal rights and equal opportunities. So what we really boil down to is the separation of church and state. And that's where this one kind of has its tie, is the separation of church and state is something that, as I said, I kind of stand behind, because the gay community, the trans community, all these different communities, the LGBT, I don't like them. I hate them on a personal level, but I do acknowledge their right. And unfortunately, with the churches, they're never going to really acknowledge some of those rights. Some churches maybe, but not all of them. So that's the reason separation of church and state is actually of an importance. Because if we keep that in place, now a person's right to be married is there, but the church does not have to acknowledge it. So, you really kind of look at it and look at the fine line. And we were living that way for a while, but now it's just became, we want the churches to acknowledge it, and they have a right. They have their rights too, just like y'all say, just like the LGBT has their rights. So do the churches. The churches have their own right too. So you can't sit there and tell the churches, you have to acknowledge my marriage. No, they don't. They really don't. They don't. I mean, you might not like it, but they have a right to their own beliefs. So you kind of got to watch that fine line. So that's why this is very important. So that's why I'm making this video. Like I said, I'm slowly trying to explain the 30 basic human rights, and I'm uploading one each day until I cover the full 30 basic human rights. Then I'm going to go into the Constitution, and I'm going to do the entire Constitution. Then I'm going to go into the Declaration of Independence from there. And I'm slowly going to start explaining it and explaining my stances with them. Because it's important that America really has a perspective from a neutral point. One that isn't completely right, but isn't completely left either. Yes, I am a Trumplican. I'm not going to deny that. But I'm a firm believer in everybody. My belief in the Constitution, my belief in the 30 basic human rights, my belief in the Declaration of Independence outweighs either party. So we have to slowly get this out here, and this is what's important in life. You have to understand that. We have to start having a neutral look at things, because you got the left over here in the LGBT that's just going ridiculous with their demands, and now the right's being censored when the right was censoring you guys. So we don't need this going back and forth. We need to start looking at this and be Americans. It needs to be America first. Like I seen a video the other day. They did a thing right after 9/11. It was inside the football stadium. You had the football players running with American flags flying everywhere. I mean, it was wonderful. We were Americans. It didn't matter what side you were on. That's where we need to be back to. Our problem right now is the government. The government's the problem. They're turning us against each other. The government's turning us against each other, and we need to stop this fighting. And we need to work at fixing the problem. You want to get upset at the cops, but it's the lawmakers that's passing the laws that the cops are having to enforce. We have to start looking at this as Americans and start really trying to do this the right way. So, thank you and have a good day.